In a small country inn, lost among the forests, travelers found not only shelter but also excellent food. The old house, more like a family estate, was known among travelers. Its owners, the Morrow couple, were famous for their hospitality and for dishes that could make them forget the long journey. That evening the rain pelted the windows, turning the road into a mud bog. There were 5 guests staying at the inn: a married couple, a young hitchhiker, a traveling salesman, and a woman who was reluctant to reveal any details about herself. The hostess, Mrs. Morrow, smiled cordially as she set the table. The smell of freshly cooked stew wafted through the rooms, evoking a tired hunger. The guests took their seats at the long wooden table, which was filled with dishes that made their mouths water: baked ribs, thick meat sauce, fragrant bread, fresh vegetables. "Bon appetit," said Mr. Morrow, pouring thick red wine into each man's glass. The silence at the table did not last long. Spoons clinked on plates, knives slid over soft meat, and the guests savored the treat. "God, this is incredibly delicious," the merchant muttered, wiping his greasy lips with a napkin. "Yes, what kind of meat? Beef?" asked the woman who had hardly spoken before. Mrs. Morrow smiled softly. "A family recipe," she replied. The young hitchhiker suddenly frowned, examining the piece of meat on his fork. "It's kind of weird," he muttered. "I think it's—" His words were interrupted by a loud knock, somewhere down in the basement. The guests froze. Mr. Morrow rose nonchalantly. "I beg your pardon," he said. "I think someone woke up early." He left the dining room, leaving the guests looking at each other. And then the knocking came again, louder, harder, as if someone was demanding to be let out. The knocking from the basement didn't stop. It was louder now, more insistent, as if someone were banging hard on the door, begging for help. The guests at the table exchanged worried glances. The young hitchhiker carefully set his fork aside, as if he'd just been snapped out of hypnosis. Is this some kind of joke?" he asked tensely. "Someone must have gotten stuck in there," the woman suggested nervously, looking around at the others. "It looks like Mr. Morrow needs help," the merchant said, rising. But Mrs. Morrow only smiled as she continued pouring wine. "Oh, don't worry, it's part of the family tradition." The guests froze. At that moment, Mr. Morrow returned, holding a huge rusty key. "Please remain in your seats," he said calmly, but there was a threat in his voice. The hitchhiker stood up, but the man slammed the key sharply on the table. "Sit down," he said, looking the guy straight in the eye. Everyone froze. Only the wine splashed quietly in the glasses. The pounding in the basement became even more hysterical. Now it was accompanied by suppressed moans. The woman stood up first. "I think we should go." "I'm afraid not," replied Mrs. Morrow, inclining her head. "Dinner is not yet finished." The young man looked at his plate. The piece of meat he had just taken a bite of suddenly seemed disgusting. His fingers trembled as he peered in horror at the fibers and thin strips of skin. He threw up right on the floor. "Jesus," he turned pale. This isn't beef." The merchant recoiled from the table, his mouth quivering. You fed it to us." Mrs. Morrow stood up, carefully adjusting her apron. "It's foolish to refuse good meat," she said calmly. "We've had a lot of guests lately, and it's not easy to survive under these conditions." The knocking from the cellar suddenly stopped. There was an eerie, oppressive silence. "But that's all right," added Mr. Morrow, walking slowly around the table. "Now we know we'll have something fresh for dinner tomorrow." Silence hung in the air like a suffocating smog. The guests did not move. Only their glances darted between Mr. and Mrs. Morrow. Fear, at first incomprehensible and distant, now enveloped them in a tight grip. The hitchhiker was the first to jump up from his chair, but Mr. Morrow snatched a long kitchen knife from under the table and set it blade down on the countertop. "Sit down," he repeated in the same calm but firm voice. The boy froze, his breathing becoming confused. The woman, the mysterious stranger, slowly slid her hand under the table. No one noticed her fumbling for something metallic in her pocket. "What's going to happen to us?" the peddler muttered, his voice trembling. Mrs. Morrow smiled affectionately. "You will stay for dinner, and perhaps be a part of it." Her words sounded so simple and mundane that it made it all the more frightening. The hitchhiker glanced at the door. "Only a few meters away, if you run." as if reading his thoughts. Mr. Morrow grinned. You want to try it? Run. The door is locked. The windows, too. He leaned forward. We've made preparations. The boy swallowed. And at that moment the woman jumped up sharply. The blade of a penknife gleamed in her hand. She dashed toward Mrs. Morrow and slashed her on the shoulder. The woman shrieked and recoiled, dropping the decanter of wine to the floor. The red liquid spilled like blood. Run! Screamed the woman. The hitchhiker rushed to the door, the peddler after him. They pushed the heavy oak door open, but it wouldn't budge. Mr. Morrow, ignoring his wounded wife, stepped forward, raising his knife. You have no way out, he said. The woman with the knife turned and kicked the table, knocking over plates, glasses, and candles. The room filled with a rumble. Then we'll make an exit, she shouted and threw the knife through the window with all her might. The glass cracked but did not shatter completely. The merchant grabbed the nearest chair and threw it at the window with a furious shout. There was a clang. Go! Yelled the hitchhiker. They rushed forward, climbing through the broken glass, clawing their hands on the edges of the frame. Mrs. Morrow, clutching her bloody shoulder, hissed through gritted teeth. We'll have to cook dinner all over again. Mr. Morrow sighed heavily and clenched his knife. Then let's go and gather the ingredients. The night forest greeted the fugitives with an icy wind and darkness. Branches whipped at their faces and their shoes sank into the wet ground. But no one stopped. They heard something rattling in the house. They're coming for us, exhaled the hitchhiker, looking over his shoulder. The woman, the one who had first resisted, clutched the bloody penknife tighter. We need to get to the road, she said, breathing hard. Do you think they'll just let us go? Gasped the merchant. We have no choice. A long howl sounded far behind them. But it wasn't a beast. They're trapping us, whispered the hitchhiker. Somewhere in the distance a light flashed, perhaps the lights of the road. Hope flared inside each of them. Hurry! But suddenly the peddler shrieked and disappeared. What? The hitchhiker turned around sharply. There was a black hole in the ground. At the bottom of the hole, the peddler was cowering, caught in the roots. Help! Shit! I'm stuck! The woman rushed toward him, reaching out her hand. Come on, grab on. But before he could grasp her fingers, a tall figure emerged from the darkness. Mr. Morrow. He jumped into the hole, and at the same instant the cold blade flashed in the moonlight. There was a short wet sound, and then silence. The merchant made no sound. Blood splattered the dirty stones. Run! Screamed the woman, turning around. The hitchhiker was already a few steps from the road, but suddenly something whipped him on his legs. A rope. He collapsed face down. Mrs. Morrow stepped out of the shadows. Come on, she said in an affectionate voice. Dinner can't be half done. The woman with the knife froze. Her chest heaved with frantic breathing. She took a step forward. Here's the main ingredient. Mr. Morrow smiled, stepping out of the darkness, dragging the bloody knife behind him. The woman's eyes darted to the hitchhiker, then to the road. She had a choice to make. Save herself, or try to save him. She made a choice. The woman gripped the knife so hard her knuckles turned white. The hitchhiker jerked at the ropes, trying to free himself. But Mrs. Morrow approached him slowly, like a predator savoring the moment. Don't you dare, shouted the woman, stepping forward. Mr. Morrow stopped beside his wife. His bloody knife gleamed in the moonlight. What are you going to do? He asked mockingly. The woman knew she had only one chance. She darted forward. Mrs. Morrow didn't have time to react. The knife plunged into her neck, piercing skin, muscle, throat. Her eyes widened with shock. She made a strange, gurgling sound, clutched at the wound, and fell to the ground, drenching the wet grass with blood. Mr. Morrow froze for a moment, then his face contorted with rage. You bitch! He roared and lunged forward. The woman jumped back, but he was faster. His hand closed around her wrist, twisting it so that the knife fell out into the grass. You think you're the first to try to fight back? He hissed. He raised the knife above his head. But he didn't have time to put it down. The hitchhiker managed to free one hand and grabbed a rock that was lying nearby. There was a muffled thump. Mr. Morrow swayed. His eyes glazed for a moment. Another thump. And another. There was a crunch. Mr. Morrow fell to his knees. Blood trickled down his forehead, flooding his eyes. The hitchhiker, breathing hard, rose. A bloody rock trembled in his hands. The woman grabbed the knife and without hesitation plunged it into Mr. Morrow's chest. The man jerked. His mouth opened as if he wanted to say something, but all that came out was a strangled wheeze. He collapsed to the ground beside his wife. Silence. Only the sound of their breathing and the wind walking through the forest. The woman looked at the hitchhiker. "Are you okay?" He nodded, still breathing heavily. The headlights of a car loomed in the distance. "We're saved," he whispered. The woman grinned tiredly. "Yeah, but something tells me they're going to remember this dinner for a long time." The headlights of the car plucked their haggard, bloody figures out of the darkness. The hitchhiker staggered to his feet, blood dripping from his trembling fingers. The woman was breathing heavily, still clutching the knife soaked in Mr. Morrow's blood. We did it," the hitchhiker muttered. She didn't say anything, just nodded, looking at the approaching lights. The car stopped abruptly at the curb, and a man in a long trench coat got out. "Jesus, what happened to you?" His voice was concerned. "Help," the hitchhiker wheezed. In that house, they..." The woman suddenly froze. Something was wrong. The man stepped closer, and in the light of the headlights it was clear. His clothes were too clean for a simple traveler. His boots shined, as if he just stepped out of the house. Her breath hitched. She noticed the man glance faintly at their bloody bodies, and then slowly smiled. "Oh," he sighed, shaking his head. "So you killed them, then?" The woman gripped the knife tighter. The hitchhiker squeezed weakly. What?" The man threw back the hem of his cloak, and the moonlight glinted on the metal buckle of his leather apron. "It's a shame," he said with feigned sadness. "They'd worked so hard. They'd chosen their guests so carefully." The woman clenched her fists. "Who are you?" The man only grinned. "The chef." She didn't have time to react. Out of the darkness, like shadows, came 3 more men. They grabbed the hitchhiker before he could escape, gagging him with a rag. The woman slashed with her knife, but the man in the raincoat intercepted her arm with surprising ease. "Take your time, dear," he whispered in her ear. "There's another dinner to come." The hitchhiker tried desperately to break free. His scream was drowned in the night. And the man added softly, "Only this time. You'll be the main courses." The hitchhiker choked in fear, feeling the stranger's hands holding him tightly, not even allowing him to move. The woman wriggled violently, but the knife was knocked out of her hands, and it fell into the wet grass with a thud. The man in the leather apron looked at them with a wistful grin. The woman suddenly froze. Something was wrong. The man stepped closer, and in the light of the headlights it was clear. His clothes were too clean for a simple traveler. His boots shined, as if he just stepped out of the house. Her breath hitched. She noticed the man glance faintly at their bloody bodies, and then slowly smiled. "Oh," he sighed, shaking his head. "So you killed them, then?" The woman gripped the knife tighter. The hitchhiker squeezed weakly. What?" The man threw back the hem of his cloak, and the moonlight glinted on the metal buckle of his leather apron. "It's a shame," he said with feigned sadness. "They'd worked so hard. They'd chosen their guests so carefully." The woman clenched her fists. "Who are you?" The man only grinned. "The chef." She didn't have time to react. Out of the darkness, like shadows, came 3 more men. They grabbed the hitchhiker before he could escape, gagging him with a rag. The woman slashed with her knife, but the man in the raincoat intercepted her arm with surprising ease. "Take your time, dear," he whispered in her ear. "There's another dinner to come." The hitchhiker tried desperately to break free. His scream was drowned in the night. And the man added softly, "Only this time. You'll be the main courses." The hitchhiker choked in fear, feeling the stranger's hands holding him tightly, not even allowing him to move. The woman wriggled violently, but the knife was knocked out of her hands, and it fell into the wet grass with a thud. The man in the leather apron looked at them with a wistful grin.